Thank you very much to the hosts for the opportunity to share and discuss insights from this ongoing project. Good afternoon and welcome to a talk about the changing landscape of citizen participation in the green energy transition in Denmark, with a focus on municipality, civil society and industry discourses. Anders and I are, as Michael said, both associate professors in the field of communication at Aalborg University in northern Denmark, and we share an interest in the dynamics of citizen participation, involvement and stakeholder dialogues, and in sustainable development and green energy transition, including the diverse conflicts of interests in these fields. And here you see an outline of the presentation. Anders will begin by introducing the Danish context of green energy transition to set the scene of our study. And then, to add to the understanding of the context, I will present initial findings from a mapping of discourses about renewable energy parks in Danish news media. After that, Anders will sketch out the purpose and the design of our research project. And this is followed by a dive into two of the cases of our study and the presentation of initial findings based on interview data from the cases. Finally, we offer some reflections that may also feed into the subsequent discussion.
Yes, thank you, and hello everybody, and thank you for showing up. As Anne-Grethe said, we'll start out with a little context on renewable energy and citizen participation in Denmark. Wind energy is central in the Danish energy system, and it has a long history, beginning with a pioneering phase in the 70s, where small wind turbines were constructed and introduced as an alternative to oil or nuclear power. The wind turbines were often owned by local associations, so citizen participation was in that sense implied from the very beginning. Later, the technology developed and larger companies took over in terms of production and ownership. And now, as in recent years, the focus on wind and increasingly also solar energy is part of a broad political consensus of green transition and green growth, you might say, in Denmark. And in a way, this is a history of success, as you can see on the figure below, which shows the development of energy production from wind, that's the blue column, or solar, that's the orange column, in the country, where you can see that renewable energy now delivers more than half of the domestic electricity supply. However, what the figure does not show is that there has been, and there is considerable local resistance towards placement of wind and solar plants. And that is the main reason why many renewable energy initiatives have failed. Not always, but in many cases. So wind and solar plants are, in Denmark, as in many other places, often sites of struggle between local citizens, municipalities, and energy companies. Next slide, please. Thank you. Moving to the legal framework for renewable energy in Denmark, it consists, first of all, of the Danish Climate Act from 2020, which sets the goal of a 70% reduction of carbon emission by 2030 compared to 1990, and climate neutrality in 2050. Second, an agreement from last year of a fourfold increase of renewable energy on land by 2030, just 6 years from now, sets the scene. And that is an increase much higher than achieved in the last decade. So very ambitious. This agreement, however, is currently contested by some energy planning experts, and we'll see what happens. Third, earlier this year, an agreement between the government and different interest groups, including the Nature Conservation Association, industry and farmer associations, was settled. This agreement foresees significantly more space for nature, such as forests and natural habitats. And then finally, concerning the planning process for wind and solar plants, there's a legal framework with a mandatory public comment period, normally 8 weeks, and some economic compensation for those living close to the facility. Quite often, however, neither of these are viewed by local citizens groups as satisfactory. And the next slide, please. So, how should we conceptualize and understand these struggles and protests? One way, quite widespread in the public debate, is to refer to the protests as a sign of a NIMBY, not in my backyard attitude. This conceptualization reduces the protest to selfish and possibly also hypocritical motives. We claim to be in favor of green transition and climate change mitigation, but are not really willing to do anything ourselves. That might be true in a few cases, but it is problematic as a general explanation. Another, in our view, more productive perspective is to view the struggles as an instance of so-called green conflicts or green-on-green conflicts, as it is referred to in the literature, where different environmental concerns collide. Could be concerns for the global climate and concerns for local nature. And a third perspective would argue that it is in fact the lack of genuine involvement and participation of local citizens and communities that is at the root of the conflicts here, resulting in both sometimes an unfair process and an unfair distribution of benefits and disadvantages, either economic, social, or environmental. Moreover, such a lack of genuine participation also increases the risk of dividing or polarizing communities, depending on whether you have the benefits or the disadvantages. And it is, of course, not helpful when it comes to mitigating climate change. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given the presentation so far, we lean more towards this perspective. And at the same time, it is worth noting that at the moment, many municipalities in Denmark, and in fact also some businesses, are currently developing new approaches to citizen involvement that go beyond the legal necessities and are not informed by an NIMBY perspective. So we are interested in exploring some of those initiatives. Over to you.
Yeah. Yeah. So, as part of gaining a more detailed understanding of the current developments in this field, we examined the news media coverage of renewable energy projects. We selected a data set of 164 news articles and opinion pieces from Danish media in the period from February 2022 to May 2024. The articles were retrieved from a large media database using words such as energy park and nature as search criteria. Firstly, our search showed that the media coverage of renewable energy projects occurs in local media rather than in national news media. And secondly, we found a highly complex landscape of resisting and supporting discourses, sometimes even drawing on the same arguments such as biodiversity. If we look at the discourses of resistance, concerns for nature frequently appear as arguments against energy parks. These concerns include, first and foremost, the protection of specific species, such as birds, bats, and frogs, but also the conservation of existing nature and unique landscapes and views play an important role in the debate. Here we see one type of green concerns for climate clash with another type of green concerns for nature and biodiversity, the kind of green-on-green conflicts that Anders just introduced. Worth noting is also that the notion of nature is used with rather different meanings. Some, for example, farmers and local residents, associate nature with extensive green fields or yellow cornfields, picturesque and peaceful landscapes, the main reason actually why they settled down in a rural area. And others do not include this in their understanding of nature at all. They associate nature with wilderness, biodiverse habitats, marshland and forests. Besides, in the discourses of resistance, we find criticism relating to the process itself, for example, of inadequate or delayed involvement, lack of information, of benefits for the local residents, lack of knowledge of the local area on the part of the companies, or a lack of a more even distribution of energy plants or projects nationwide. If we switch to the discourses of support, they tend to express win-win situations based on the anticipated economic gains in terms of jobs, investments, settlement, and tourism, but also on environmental gains in terms of less use of pesticides, fertilizers, etc., which means a better water protection. The win-win discourse of being able to save both the climate, symbolized by polar bears, and the threatened birds, bats, and frogs, etc., when building green energy parks is also adopted by many of the energy companies, as we will return to later. And to you, Anders.
Thank you. Right. We need to go back.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. to the research
yeah.
purpose. Yes, right. Our presentation today is based in a small 2-year research project called DEEP, Designing Community Collaboration for Sustainable Energy Parks, with the purpose of examining potentially good practices for citizen involvement in the green energy transition. And good here means two things. First, it means practices that are truly participatory and democratic. And we can, of course, discuss what that means later on. And secondly, practices that allows for combining climate concerns with other environmental concerns, such as biodiversity, landscape quality, and so on, also as touched upon by Anne-Grethe before. We have the project has partners at Copenhagen and Aalborg University, and it also includes the independent organization Nordic Folkecenter for Renewable Energy, and that is the name in English, which is situated, by the way, in near one of the case sites. Yes, and finally, as a part of the project, we also aim to feed some of our results back to the practitioners from civil society, municipalities, and businesses, and to learn from their response to that as well. Next slide, please. Before we go into our cases and our empirical studies so far, a few words on the research design. It's designed as a qualitative multiple case study with 2 primary cases and some secondary cases, along with observations and documents, media documents, for instance. Our main data will be interviews with key stakeholders. And once again, key stakeholders from this communication triad: municipality, business, civil society. Methodologically, we are informed by discourse studies in general, as Michael indicated in the introduction, particularly critical discourse analysis, as well as the sociology of knowledge approach to discourse. And as for our approach to participation, it is twofold. On the one hand, we aim to analyze discursive representations of participation or non-participation, failed participation, as articulated in the interviews. That could be, for instance, articulations of ideals or obstacles to participation, causal explanations, what is related to participation, what leads to, what does not lead to participation, arguments, metaphors, and so on. And on the other hand, we also aim to analyze practices of participation, not least with a view for emerging networks or constellations or connections of practices that may be productive for citizen and community participation. And with the caveat that we are still not halfway into the project, let's have a look at our two primary cases.
Yes, the first case, Thisted Municipality. We would like to take you on a virtual trip to that first case in the northwest of Denmark. As you can see on the map, we have the municipality of Thisted with about 43,000 inhabitants, and the region as such is called Thy. As you can, and it's mostly a rural area with unique and rare landscapes, part of which is also a national park and as such a protected area along the coast in the north. The dominant sectors are fishery, agriculture, food industry, metal and plastics industry, and tourism. And as you can probably imagine, it's a rather windy region, not least because of the long coastline. But it's in this context, a strong wind is a good thing, both as an energy source and for attracting a specific segment of tourists, namely windsurfers, who come together in the surfer paradise called Cold Hawaii.
We have to say that the Tourist Association paid us for this commercial. So
no.
Okay.
Not that this is of any specific relevance to our research project, the last thing. But what is of relevance is that the municipality of Thisted has turned their strategies for citizen involvement upside down in the last few years and is beginning to reap the fruits of this reorganization, all of which makes it an interesting case for us, since we seek to identify good practices of citizen involvement. Previously, they experienced a lot of barriers and resistance against green energy projects, and for several years were not able to establish more than a single plant. And for example, when they announced a public comment period in relation to a proposed energy project, they received an overwhelming number of negative responses, which overburdened the administration completely. However, these negative experiences led to a fundamental change in the approach and in the roles of both civil society and the municipality itself. The new approach proposed a delegation of initiative to local communities regarding the design, how should it look like, what kinds of green energy should be included, the negotiation with the project developers, typically the energy companies, co-ownership, and a minimum of 50% community support. The municipality role also changed, and they created a new team only to focus on supporting the local communities in their green energy projects, offer expertise, sparring, and facilitate networking between these communities. As part of the paradigm shift, that's what we call it, the municipality developed a so-called Thy model or model for citizen participation in green energy transition. This model is built upon three principles: a division into negative zones, neutral zones, and energy zones of the whole municipality. This means that the green zones are where there can be no energy projects or energy plants. Among other things, the protected national park. The yellow ones are where they can be energy projects, but only if driven by a local initiative and documented community support. And the red ones are where the municipality has pointed out energy project sites. The second principles are a set of criteria that should serve or will serve as guidelines for the municipal council when prioritizing new renewable energy projects. And you can see the 5 criteria that are a result of a involvement process. They are local co-ownership, compensation for neighbors, forest, nature and recreational facilities as part of these energy parks, concerns for landscape and local support, not least. And the third principle of the TRY model is energy associations, or the encouragement to build energy associations, which should provide a fundamental voice for the local communities. Yes.
All right. And now moving from the principles that Anne-Grethe talked about to the involvement process, our initial research shows several practices of involving local communities long before the mandatory public comment period. First, the 5 criteria for deciding on renewable energy parks were not simply decided by the City Council, but were informed by a comprehensive consultation, including public hearings, workshops, and an electronic survey that was sent to all residents. I think there's a sort of a meta-communicative element here, asking people to help decide on how to make societal decisions on renewable energy. Secondly, concerning the energy associations, the municipal team reached out to many existing civil associations across the municipality area, 60 associations or so, in order to promote the energy association idea, and at the same time to build trust in the whole model. And the key message here was get organized in energy organizations locally. So in a sense, a top-down initiative aiming at a bottom-up organization. And thirdly, the formation of energy associations were followed by the setup of a forum or a platform for exchange between the individual associations. There are 7 of them at the time of speaking. The purpose of the forum was to enable mutual learning among the energy associations, not necessarily mediated by the municipal team. And finally, the energy associations were offered consultations or consultation by an independent energy consultant. And the idea here was to empower or to build capacities in the energy associations, again, in order to better match the knowledge level in the energy businesses, and thereby to sort of even out some of the power imbalance that most probably would exist. And the next slide, please. We would like to supplement the observations from TRY with a few remarks on our second primary case, a village in the municipality of Kolding in the southeast of the peninsula Jutland. This case differs from the previous in different ways. It does not encompass a whole municipality, but just a single solar plant. The involvement process was to a high degree not facilitated by the municipality, but by an energy company. And the solar park is actually almost ready to be put into operation. They're also very different from our TRY case. What is interesting here, we think, in terms of participation, is that the process covered a longer time span, 2 to 3 years, with many meetings between community representatives, municipality, and energy businesses. And this process was characterized by continuous revisions, sometimes also major changes of the placement and design of the solar plant. The process also included experts and forms of knowledge normally not associated with energy businesses, at least to our knowledge, such as a biologist in charge of the nature or landscape planning, who was employed by the energy business. According to the community representatives, the involvement process has actually resulted in significant civil society influence and added social value. For instance, in the form of new animal habitats, of walking and biking pathways in an area that didn't used to be accessible. It used to be farmland, shelters, a playground, and so on. The Danish Nature Conservation Association has also praised the project as an example to follow. It remains to be said, however, that the placement of the solar plant was not suggested by the local community in the first place. But still, we think it offers some participatory potential to study more closely. Next slide, over to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So these are our initial findings. But since we are still in the data collection phase and didn't have time to really work with our data yet, our initial findings are mostly based on our memory and first impressions from interviews with 2 municipality employees and 3 energy association members in the case 1, Tisted, and 1 interviewee from the civic association in case 2. To sum up our initial findings, we see in the municipality of Tisted discourses of empowerment, responsiveness, transparency, and early stage involvement. They delegate competence, authority, control, and responsibility to the local communities to a certain degree, and also distribute the gains by encouraging co-ownership. They are investing a lot of time and energy in being in close contact with civil society, listening to their ideas and concerns, engaging in debates, being available, and they seem to realize and emphasize the importance of early stage involvement. We could call it a top-down initiation of bottom-up organization. However, they also see a business case and regard the green transition as a green growth strategy for new business adventures. Moving on to civil society discourses, we found a clear recognition among these members of green energy transition as a compulsory task, a must. And we found strong indications of local cohesion, community attachment, and concern for community development, also in terms of settlement. Also a very time-consuming and resource-intensive participation process. They spent a lot of time and energy, but they also felt a significant influence that they could, that they had an impact on the decisions. We see it as a kind of paradox that there is a really strong engagement in the green transition, but it's not driven by an engagement for the green transition. It's more because somebody says, and we can't avoid it. The decision makers made the decision, and well, we must find a way to go about it. So let's try to make the best of it. Regarding the industry discourses, we haven't interviewed any of the energy companies yet, but based on the interactions referred to in the interviews, it seems that they, or at least some of them, definitely not all of them, prioritize a dialogue with civil society and put quite a lot of effort into it by also hiring experts on biodiversity, etc., landscape planning, and that they seem to recognize the citizens' input and feedback. as important. And as mentioned earlier, they also adopt this win-win discourse of both saving the climate and the polar bears and promoting green energy, which also adds a multifunctional dimension to many of the energy parks. Yeah.
Right. To supplement what Anne-Grethe just said, we will end with some reflections on what this could imply for our understanding of citizen and community participation in the green energy transition, perhaps also beyond that. And overall, our initial results show that participation is, you could say, distributed across different practices. For instance, the case from Thy illustrates how the communication between municipality, energy business, and local community about a potential renewable energy plant sometime in the future, wind, solar, or other, is preceded by a wide range of practices. For instance, energy consultation with an independent expert, exchange of experiences between different energy associations, and if we go further back, also the formation of energy associations by way of the municipal team initiative. So, and altogether, it seems that these practices have potential for facilitating and strengthening participation of local communities in the planning and decision-making of renewable energy plants. Similarly, the case from Kolding illustrates how citizen participation is not concentrated in a single or few interactions, such as the classic citizen meeting or the public hearing, but in contrast, stretches across a thick or dense set of interactions with continuous negotiations and changes. At the same time, we think that both cases point to the importance of representation within the local community. That is, representation of many citizens by a few citizens. The energy associations in Thy are supposed to represent the community when it comes to green energy transition, that is, represent maybe 500 or 1,000 people. And the local representatives at the Kolding site also acted in the negotiations with the energy company and the municipality on behalf of a whole village, or maybe even 2 villages. So this raises the question as to how the legitimacy of such a representation can be ensured. Similarly, it is worth asking, we think, to what extent the involvement process allows for different forms of locally relevant knowledge to be articulated and included in the decision-making process. So what sort of knowledge makes it into the process and what sort of knowledge does not? And finally, we think that we need to know more about barriers to this type of distributed participation, you may call it, whether legal, economic, social, or other. So with these words, we thank you for your attention and look forward to questions and comments. Thank you.
Yeah, and just very finally, we have a slide on with the references that we have drawn on. So yeah, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very